You probably know the scene of the Christmas story. You've got the sleeping baby, the hopeful parents, the quiet night, and a feeling of absolute stillness. But that's only half the story. Because if you could pull back the curtain and see the spiritual reality of that night, the peace would evaporate instantly. You wouldn't see a silent night. You'd see a terrifying red dragon standing before a woman, waiting to devour her child the moment he draws breath. The other half of the story, the half that's been hidden or lost in history, isn't a story of calm. It's a story of danger and of violence. This was a cosmic invasion that signaled the ultimate victory of God over Satan. It really happened. This isn't a metaphor. It isn't a theological allegory. And because it was real, it left evidence. We can pinpoint the exact time, the location, and the players involved. Scholars and astronomers have debated the date for centuries, but the clue might have been right there in the stars all along. If you think you know the story of the Nativity, you only know the cover story. It's time to look at the event that terrified the powers of darkness and started a war that's still raging today. But first, before we dig in, a quick break. If you lead volunteers in ministry, check out servehq.church. It's the best way to train your volunteers quickly so you can focus on ministry. Also, for those of you who want to dig deeper into the research, I've put together a list of recommended books on this episode. You can find the affiliate links for those in the description below. In fact, I do this for all of my videos, so all of my videos have extra reading material for you. And finally, if you prefer to listen, these episodes are now available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. All right, back to the war. Before we go any further, I want to offer a quick word of caution. The goal today isn't to tear down the traditional picture of Christmas. The peace in the manger was real, but we need to understand the cost of that peace. We celebrate peace on earth, but we often forget that this peace was only possible because of the violence that was happening in the heavens. This isn't about undermining the manger scene. We're adding to the context that makes it so special, because when you look at the spiritual reality, the birth of Jesus was more than just a tender family moment. It was the reclaiming of occupied territory. The moment that baby took his first breath, it was a declaration of war against the dragon, the enemy, that ancient enemy who stood ready to devour the child. But we focus so much on the silence of that night that we've missed the thunder of the war drums. So today we're opening the files on the cosmic war that was sparked in Bethlehem. We'll examine the astronomical evidence that points to a specific date, a date written in the stars long before it was written in the Gospels. And finally, we'll identify the dragon that was waiting in the shadows. It's time to shed light on the other half of the Christmas story that no one talks about. Most people open the book of Revelation expecting to find a crystal ball that predicts the future. They scan the pages looking for hints of impending events, like earthquakes or world leaders rising to power or rumors of war. We've been trained to view this text only as a roadmap of the end of history. But there's a strong possibility that we aren't reading it entirely right. What if Revelation isn't only predicting what will happen? Is it possible that right in the middle of all the visions of the future that John saw, he also saw a glimpse of the past, a flashback to an almost cataclysm that took place at the same time as Jesus was being born? To understand the full story of the birth of Jesus, we have to look at John's vision in Revelation chapter 12. John interrupts the timeline of the end to show us the cosmic war that started in Genesis and climaxed in Bethlehem. He turns our attention to the heavens and introduces us to a dragon standing in front of a woman in painful labor, waiting to devour her newborn child. He describes a cosmic battle that disrupted the powers of darkness, and he gives us an explanation for the spiritual warfare that still threatens God's people today. Today, we're going to look at the evidence in the stars to pinpoint the exact date of Jesus' birth and find out why the nativity that we know and love was actually only half the story. Revelation chapter 12. Look at verse 1. It says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head." We can pause right there, because this is where things get uncomfortable real quick for a lot of modern readers. John says he saw a sign in the heavens. Now, we hear that word sign and we might think of the word miracle. We think of a burning bush or water turning into wine. We think of something supernatural breaking into the natural world. But that's not what the ancient reader would have thought. In the ancient world, if you talked about signs in the heavens, you were talking about stars. You were talking about constellations. And I know what you might be thinking. Scott, are you teaching us about astrology? It's a fair question. We've been trained to put a massive wall between astronomy, which is the science of stars, and astrology, which is the belief that stars have meaning. And for good reason. The Bible is incredibly strict about not worshiping the stars or looking to them to run your life. And with that, Deuteronomy is clear. Don't look up at the sun, moon, and stars and be led astray to bow down to them. But we have to distinguish between worshiping the sign and reading the sign. Let's go back to page 1 in your Bible for a moment. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. Why did God create the lights in the expanse of the sky? He said, "Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." The Hebrew word there for signs is the same word used for the mark on Cain or the blood on the doorposts at Passover. It means a signal. God built the universe with a clockwork mechanism in the sky. He arranged the stars in patterns that tell a story. And he sets the planets in motion to act as hands on that clock. So when John says, "I saw a great sign in heaven," it's not like he's having a hallucination. He's just looking up. He's describing a specific astronomical arrangement that marks a specific moment in history. And this is where the Christmas story that you know suddenly crashes into the Christmas story that you don't know. First off, think about the Magi. We love to put these guys in our nativity sets. We sing "We Three Kings." But have you ever stopped to ask the obvious questions? How did they know? The Bible says that these guys were from the East, like Babylon or Persia. They weren't Jewish, it's pretty clear. They weren't looking for a baby in a manger. They were looking at the sky. Matthew chapter 2 tells us very plainly, it says, "We saw his star when it rose." They're talking about stars. These men were astronomers. They watched the movements of the planets against the backdrop of the constellations with mathematical precision. And they saw something so specific, so impossible to ignore, that they packed their bags and traveled 800 miles or more across the desert to find a Jewish toddler. So let's put our detective hats on. Let's get curious here. Can we find this sign? If we used modern astronomy software to rewind the clock of the universe, can we find a moment where this exact picture appeared in the sky? Back to Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet." Well, there's only one woman in the zodiac, the constellation Virgo, the Virgin. That's easy enough to identify. But the text gets way more specific. It says she is clothed with the sun. So this narrows our search down to about a month window in any given year, usually late August to about late September. But then John adds another data point. With the moon under her feet, he said. And so now we're looking for a specific day where the sun is in the body of the Virgin and the moon is positioned directly at her feet. And then comes the final clue. A crown of 12 stars on her head. This is a tricky one. Virgo doesn't have a crown of 12 stars. But directly above the head of Virgo is the constellation Leo, the lion. Leo is made up of 9 primary stars. So for there to be a crown of 12 stars, we need 3 planets, which the ancients called the wandering stars, to move into formation right around the head of Virgo, joining the 9 stars of Leo to make 12. When you plug all of these variables into the computer, sun in Virgo, moon at her feet, 3 planets in Leo, you don't get a recurring annual event. You get a needle in a cosmic haystack. You get a very specific date in history. September 11th, 3 BC. This arrangement happened. It is a literal historical timestamp stamped onto the ceiling of the universe. And do you know what that day was on the Jewish calendar? It was Tishri 1, Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. This has huge significance. In the Jewish household, Tishri 1 wasn't just the New Year's Day. It was the coronation day for kings. It was the day you blew the shofar, their trumpet, to announce that a new ruler was taking the throne. But this raises the next big question. If the sign is real, who is the woman? If you grew up in church, your knee-jerk reaction is probably to say it's Mary. And that makes sense. She's pregnant. She gives birth to the male child who rules the nations. It fits just fine. But in biblical prophecy, symbols are rarely just one person. They usually incorporate more than one thing. They represent a group, a people, a household. So look closely at the details again. We have a sun, the moon, and 12 stars. Does that combination ring a bell? Well, if you know your biblical history, it should. We've seen it before. And it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 37. If you'll remember Joseph, the guy with the coat of many colors, he had a dream. He sees the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to him, and he is the 12th star. His father Jacob knows exactly what the dream means immediately. He interprets it in verse 10. He says, "Shall I and your mothers and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" Jacob understands that the son, Jacob, is the patriarch. The moon is Rachel, the mother. The stars are the brothers, the tribes of Israel. So when John sees this woman in Revelation 12, wearing the sun, moon, and 12 stars, he sees more than just Mary. He's seeing the family, the household of God. He's seeing the faithful of Israel. This is the woman who has been laboring for 2,000 years. Think about the story we've been tracing in this series. Ever since Genesis 3, there's been a promise that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And for centuries, the household of faith has been waiting for that promise to be realized. This is why the Old Testament is so obsessed with genealogies. The entire history of Israel is the history of labor pains. It's Sarah waiting for Isaac. It's Hannah crying for Samuel. It's the nation groaning under exile, waiting for the Messiah. The woman in Revelation 12 is the collective faithfulness of God's people, stretching all the way back to Eve, agonizing to bring forth the heir who will finally fix the broken family. And finally, on this specific night in 3 BC, under the sign of the Virgin, the labor is over. The seed arrives. The household finally has its heir. It's a beautiful picture, right? The stars are aligned. The king is born. The promise is kept. But there's a problem, because John's vision doesn't stop with the beautiful woman. Verse 3 says, "Then another sign appeared in heaven." This is the part that doesn't really make it onto greeting cards, because standing right in front of the woman, blocking her path and waiting for the delivery, is a monster. It says an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and he isn't there to celebrate. Verse 4 says he stood before the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment he was born. We move from a quiet nativity scene to a murder scene in one verse. And to understand who this dragon is and why he's so terrified of this baby, we have to go back to the very beginning of the household. We have to go back to the moment the first family fell. Because this war didn't start in Bethlehem. It started in Eden. And the dragon has been hunting this baby for a very, very long time. We've got the scene set. You have the woman, faithful Israel, clothed in the sun, finally giving birth to the Messiah. The stars have aligned. The moment has arrived. But verse 3 introduces the villain. It says, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon its heads." If you've spent any time in church, you probably have a quick answer for who this is. You see dragon and you immediately think Satan. And you're right. There's no trick here. Verse 9 explicitly calls him that. It says he's the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. But remember, we aren't looking at theology here. We're looking at history. We're looking at an event that actually happened in real time with real people. If the woman represents the faithful community of Israel and the child represents the historical Jesus, then who is the dragon? Who was the power standing ready to devour the child the moment he was born? We don't have to guess. We just have to look at the history books. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there was a king sitting on the throne in Jerusalem named Herod the Great. And Great is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. He was a builder, sure. He was expanding the temple. He built massive fortresses like Masada and the Herodium. But he was also a paranoid, violent tyrant who murdered his own wife and 3 of his own sons just to protect his power. When the Magi showed up in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the one who was born king of the Jews?" Herod didn't take it as good news. He took it as a threat, and he reacted exactly like a dragon would act. Matthew chapter 2 tells us that when Herod realized he'd been outsmarted by the Magi, he was furious. He gave orders to kill all of the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under. Can you imagine the horror of that moment? Soldiers marching into a quiet village, the screams of mothers, the slaughter of innocents. It's the darkest part of the Christmas story, and honestly, we usually skip it. It doesn't fit on the ornament, of course. It's a little morbid, but Revelation 12 tells us what was actually happening. Herod wasn't just a jealous politician. He was the earthly instrument of a spiritual power. The dragon was standing in front of the woman, using the political and military machinery of Rome to try and wipe out the seed before he could grow up. And this isn't the first time we've seen this. This is the climax of a war that's been raging since page 3 of your Bible. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. God curses the serpent in the garden. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. This is what you might call the seed war. For 4,000 years, the serpent has been trying to stop the seed of the woman from arriving. You see it with Cain murdering Abel, the first attempt to cut off the righteous line. You see it with Pharaoh ordering the Hebrew midwives to kill every baby boy born to the Israelites. You see it with Haman in the book of Esther, plotting a genocide to wipe out the entire Jewish people. You see it with Queen Athaliah in 2 Kings, slaughtering the entire royal family to try and cut off the line of David. Every single time, the enemy tries to devour the offspring. And every single time, God preserves a remnant. So when we see the dragon in Revelation 12, he's not a new monster. We're seeing the ancient enemy making his boldest move yet. But John gives us some weird details about this dragon that we need to unpack. 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns. To be honest, it sounds like a creature from a bad sci-fi movie. But in the ancient world, and specifically in Jewish prophecy, these weren't random monster parts. They were political code. If you've read the book of Daniel, this should sound familiar. In Daniel chapter 7, he sees a series of beasts rising out of the sea, representing the empires of the world. The 4th beast, the terrifying one, has 10 horns. Horns represent power. In fact, a common phrase in the scriptures to refer to the power of salvation is to call it the horn of salvation. Heads represent authority, crowns represent rule. When John paints the dragon with these symbols, he's telling us something profound about how the enemy works. Satan doesn't just float around like a spooky ghost. He works through empires. He works through political systems. He claims authority over the kingdoms of the world. This is the idea behind the powers and principalities in high places that Paul talks about. Remember the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Satan takes Jesus to a high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he says something a little chilling. He says, I'll give you all of their authority and splendor. It's been given to me, and I can give it to anyone that I want. What's interesting is that Jesus doesn't correct him. He doesn't say, actually, you don't own those things. He refuses to worship him, but he acknowledges the reality that the dragon has wrapped its coils around the structures of human power. So when Jesus is born in that manger, he's entering a tense political system, to be sure, but he's also stepping into a cosmic civil war. The powers of heaven and the powers of darkness are converging on this one tiny coordinate in Judea. And it looks like the dragon is going to win. He has the armies, the king, the power. But look at what happens next in verse 5. It says, And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. John plays a little loose with the timeline here. He fast-forwards the entire life of Jesus in just one sentence. He's born, he rules, and then he's snatched up. He skips the miracles, he skips the teaching, he even skips the cross and the tomb in the specific summary, but he jumps straight to the ascension. Why? Well, because in this vision, the point is the escape. The dragon strikes, but he misses. The child completes his mission and ascends to the throne of God, completely out of the reach of the dragon. So what does a frustrated dragon do when he can't catch his prey? He turns on the mother. Verse 6 says, And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days, which is 1,260 days. This is where the history and the theology start to blend beautifully. Historically, we know that Mary and Joseph literally fled. An angel warned Joseph in a dream. He said, Get up, take thy child and his mother, and escape to Egypt. They became refugees and went into the wilderness to hide from the dragon's wrath. To us, the wilderness sounds scary. It sounds like a place where you die. But in the Bible, the wilderness is the place where God meets his people in the Old Testament. It's where he protects them. Think about the Exodus. When Pharaoh, and he's the dragon in that story, tried to destroy Israel, God brought them into the wilderness. That's where he fed them with manna. He protected them with a pillar of fire. He carried them, as Exodus 19 says, on wings of eagles. Revelation 12 later uses the same exact image. The woman is given the wings of a great eagle to fly to the wilderness. The most important thing to understand is that they are not abandoned in the wilderness. It's a place of nourishment, like a sanctuary. God's saying, you can't touch them here. I've prepared a place of safety. So the Act 2 curtain closes on a mixed scene. The child is safe on the throne. The woman is safe in the wilderness. But the dragon, he's furious. He's been humiliated. He tried to stop the birth and he failed. He tried to kill the child and he failed. He tried to destroy the mother and she escaped. And now he has nowhere else to go but down. Because while all of this was happening on earth, while shepherds were watching their flocks and Magi were traveling and Herod was plotting, something else was happening in the spiritual realm. In the last act of this cosmic play, the dragon missed. He tried to devour the child, but the child is snatched up to God and to his throne. That's the Ascension. The mission is accomplished. The king is seated. But the story isn't over. In fact, for the dragon, the nightmare is just beginning. Because when the child arrives in heaven, he doesn't just sit down. He cleans house. Look at chapter 12 of Revelation, verse 7. It says there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels and prevailed not. Neither was there a place found any more in heaven. Now stop and let that sink in. They lost their place. We usually read this passage and imagine a scene from something like the Lord of the Rings. We picture swords clashing and lightning bolts flying, angels wrestling the demons in the clouds. We think of it as like a cosmic contest of raw power. But if you look at the text closely, the battle wasn't decided by muscle. It was decided by merit. The dragon didn't lose a fist fight. He lost a court case. Verse 10 tells us exactly how he was defeated. Listen to the announcement that rings out in heaven immediately after the dragon falls. It says this, "And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, 'Now is come salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of the brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night.'" The accuser. In Hebrew, the word for this is ha-satan, the Satan. It's a job title more than a name. It means prosecutor. And for thousands of years, this was the dragon's access card to heaven. He wasn't there as a friend, he was there as a lawyer. He stood before the throne of God and pointed his finger at humanity. And the tragedy is, he was right. He could point to David's adultery. He could point to Noah's drunkenness. He could point to Israel's idolatry. He could point to your sin and to my sin. He had a stack of evidence proving that the human family was broken and rebellious and unfit for God's presence. But then the child arrives. The child who lived a perfect life, the child who died a sacrificial death, the child who paid the family debt in full. And suddenly, the prosecutor has no more evidence. The files are empty, the debt is canceled, the accusations don't stick anymore. When Revelation says Michael fought the dragon, it's not just a military victory, it's an eviction. It's as if the bailiff is throwing a disbarred lawyer out of the courtroom because he has no case left to argue. And this is the turning point in history. Many Christians read Revelation 12 and think this is something that's going to happen in the future, right at the end of time. But the text doesn't really let us do that. Verse 11 says they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. That's the cross. That's what happened in the first century. This is a spiritual reality of what happened when Jesus ascended. Do you remember what Jesus said to his disciples in Luke chapter 10? The 72 came back from their mission, excited that demons were submitting to them. And Jesus looks at them and says something a little strange. He says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Jesus knew what was coming. He knew that his work on the cross was going to revoke the dragon's access to heaven. Revelation 12 says, "The great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." This is the victory of Christmas. It's not just that a baby was born. It's that the accuser was silenced. It's that the legal claim against you and against me was destroyed. Whatever accusations the enemy tries to bring against you today, they're inadmissible evidence. They've been thrown out of the court. And that not guilty verdict applies to anyone who's put their faith in Jesus. bought with his precious blood. And in verse 12, heaven goes wild. It says, "Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye who dwell in them." It's a full-on celebration. The halls of heaven are finally cleared. The dark shadow that used to stand before the throne accusing the brethren is gone. The joy is uncontainable. But, and this is a massive but, verse 12 doesn't end there. It goes on to say, "But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short." If Jesus won, why is the world still such a mess? If the kingdom has come, why is there still so much pain? If the dragon was defeated, why does it feel like he's still roaring? We aren't witnessing the confident march of a conquering dragon here. We're seeing the violent thrashing of a wounded animal. He's filled with fury because he knows he's lost. And who does he take that fury out on? Well, he can't touch the child. Jesus is safe on his throne. He can't touch heaven. He's been locked out. So he turns his eyes to the only target he has left. He looks back at the woman. He looks at the people of God still living on the earth. And we see in chapter 12, the war shifts fronts. It moves from the courtroom of heaven to the wilderness of earth. And this is where the story stops being about history and starts being about us. Because in the final act of this drama, the dragon comes after the rest of her offspring. He comes after those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. That's you and me. So the dragon is thrown from the heavenly courtroom and hits the ground. He's lost his access to the prosecution table. He can no longer accuse the brethren before God because the debt has been paid in full. But he's not dead. He's just grounded. And like I said, he's furious. He knows his time is short. So what does he do? Verse 13 tells us exactly what happens next. It says, "And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child." If he can't stop the son, he's going to destroy the mother. If he can't stop the king, he's going to wipe out the kingdom. And this chase scene leads us to one of the most cryptic and beautiful images in the entire Bible. In chapter 12, verse 14, it says, "And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times, and half a time, from the face of the serpent." Now stop. If you read this with a modern sci-fi mindset, you're picturing a woman sprouting giant bird wings and flying away. It sounds really weird, like fantasy fiction or something. But if you read this with a Jewish mindset, if you read it knowing your Old Testament, you don't see a bird, you see a covenant. God used this exact same language when he brought Israel out of Egypt. In Exodus 19, verse 4, God says to Moses, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Now, of course, God isn't saying that the Israelites flew on giant birds across the Red Sea. He was saying, I carried you. I lifted you out of danger. I moved you supernaturally from the place of slavery to the place of safety. So the woman, the faithful family of God in the first century, escapes into the wilderness, and the dragon realizes he can't catch her. She's moving too fast. She's being carried by something he can't compete with. So he changes his tactics. If he can't catch her, he'll drown her. Verse 15 says, "And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away with the flood." Again, in this case, we have to decode some symbols. In the ancient world, and specifically in the Hebrew Bible, floods and raging waters are almost always symbols of invading armies or overwhelming persecution. Isaiah 8 describes the king of Assyria as a flood that rises up the neck. Psalm 18 describes the torrents of destruction that overwhelm the soul. The dragon isn't spitting literal H2O here. He's unleashing a flood of violence. He's stirring up the nations, the political powers, the human systems of control to wipe this new messianic community off the map. And historically, we know this happened. In the first century, the early church faced a flood of persecution. First from the religious leaders in Jerusalem, and then brutally from the Roman Empire itself. Nero, Domitian, the great crushing weight of the beast, trying to drown the infant church before it could learn to walk. It looked like the end. It looked like the dragon was finally going to win. But look at verse 16 in Revelation 12. It says, "And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth." This is God's providence in action. It means that even the ground itself is on God's side. There's a fascinating historical connection here that many scholars point to. Just before the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, an event that would have wiped out the mother church completely, history tells us that the Jewish believers fled the city. They crossed the Jordan River and hid in the city of Pella in the wilderness. While the Roman flood destroyed the city, the earth of the wilderness swallowed the danger, and the people of God were safe. The dragon tried to drown them, but the ground refused to cooperate. And this brings us to the most important verse in the chapter, verse 17. This is the hinge point. This is the moment where John stops talking about history and turns to look directly at you. Verse 17 says, "And the dragon was wroth or angry with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." Think about the family tree here. The woman gave birth to the male child, that's Jesus. But she has other children. She has offspring who are still on the earth, still keeping the commands, still holding the testimony. Who are they? They're us. That is, they're the church. They're every believer from the first century until today who has been adopted into this household of God. This explains the world that you live in. It explains why following Jesus feels like a battle, and why, even though we know that the victory is won, we still get bruised. We are the targets of a defeated enemy. The dragon is waging a guerrilla war against the siblings of the king. He knows he can't take the throne, so he tries to hurt the family. But notice how we are identified. We aren't defined by our fear of the dragon. We're defined by two things. We keep the commandments of God, and we hold fast to the testimony of Jesus. That word testimony is powerful. In the Greek, it's martyria, is where we get the word martyr from. It doesn't necessarily mean dying. It means living in such a way that your life proves the dragon is a liar. Every time that you choose forgiveness over revenge, you're holding the testimony. Every time you choose generosity over greed, you're fighting the dragon. Every time you choose love over hate, you're defeating the enemy. The dragon has a river of lies, a flood of persecution, a roar that shakes the earth. But we have something much stronger. We have the testimony of the Lamb. Today, I want you to see the Christmas story for what it really is. Yes, it's a baby in a manger, but it's also the invasion that broke the dragon's back. It's the story of the king who came down to rescue his family, a king who evicted the accuser from the courtroom and who prepares a place for us in safety.